Pharaoh's Rustic Queen, a short story. Pharaoh's Rustic Queen, or The Golden Thread, or Luxor Murrumbidgee. Our hero is taken to the place where a local Egyptian cult buried their queen in the late 1920s. Over against the stealthy divide, red clay gives way to white, putrid and sticky, and whopping potholes loom up to obfuscate the sullen tracks among a mess of stunted river gums. Ken, in the dirty grey Toyota, rode the bumps, flinging the wheel left and right, and explained the necessary connections. "So my grandmother," he was saying above the hubbub, thrashing the pedal, "she was a surly Thorpe from Cornwall who came out here to make pasties for the miners. She was one of 19 children." Buster Craven was impressed. His coccyx ached from broken springs, and from time to time he glanced sideways into the low-lying scrub looking out for landmarks. 19 children, he marvelled. Gee. "And she met my grandfather, Frosty, at a country women's do down at Ivy's Rump. This was before they found the golden thread." The allusion here was to the chubbiest filter of gold ore ever known to split the wedges of redoundable quartz, a thread of fabulous wealth that rekindled the lagging boom. It brought diggers from Italy and far-flung China. "They were married at the little church in West Beluga," he then related, dipping into the family albums of his mind, and went on to say how Frosty took a job on the steamers and the wool barges, plying the furtive river, hauling a new nation's bounty down to the open sea. It was an uncomfortable afternoon. They set out after lunch, driving south from Bangham Bridges along the interstate, then veering into the wild and uncharted wastes where the river floods every 4 or 5 seasons. It was the land of the angry goanna. The trees were gnarled from dipping their toes into smelly silt. The coffee bush was peppery and gasped for lack of oxygen. Beyond it all lay 1,000,000 square acres of bitter, dark sand. "So how," asked Buster, trying to cut through the nostalgia, "did your grandfather come to know about the hidden tomb?" "Well, that's a long story," said Ken. But like any man riding roughshod through the swelter of riverlands in a dirty grey Toyota, he was willing to oblige. The questions were manifold. What was Frosty's involvement? How reliable were his contacts? Was it all but a distant dream? Who owned the stolen artefacts? How were they brought to Australia anyway? And how does this connect to the golden thread? The entire matter began, Ken did gesticulate when he finally got around to it. They burst through another runnel. Back in 1922. It was the year of the sloppy tea towel scandal, and men and women of social conscience were looking for another way. Then, out of nowhere, as if by a miracle, teams of brown local men in stark white turbans near far-off Cairo on the Nile shovelled down to the sealed door, and the famous Howard Cartwise, boffin for the brassy Earl of Carnarvon, discovered Tutankhamun's hidden room. From there, word spread quickly. It was a triumph of the Telegraph. In no time an article appeared in the Bangham Bridges Gazette. "Ancient mystery solved," it said, and it included a description of the stunning death mask and the blissful limelight in which all the Egyptologists of the world were suddenly basking. Most significantly, it included a quotation from the Grand Warden of the Luxor Lodge in Elegant Ridge, Sir Henry Trudgeberry, who said he and his lodge members had known it all along. He expected the secrets of the ages to now unfold in an unrelenting manner. By that November it was a craze, and local ladies started sporting eyeliner like long-necked Nefertiti. "I've seen the exhibition," Buster boasted. Ken seemed unmoved. "The whole region was abuzz with things Egyptian," he insisted, going backwards into the annals. which was entirely true. Perfectly sane people started purchasing copies of the 2-volume Wallace Budge. The regional savants started boning up on their mummies. Ken explained further that once word of Tutankhamun's tomb reached saturation point, rumours began concerning other ancient depositories of golden objects, and amateur diggers started excavating their own backyards in hope of majestic fortunes. Scholars started giving lectures, and a dancing fad whereby couples would embrace like hieroglyphics, observing frontality, spread like the raging measles. It was Tutankhamun this and Tutankhamun that, and horse owners started naming trotters things like Lucky Osiris and Grand Hathor. The notice from Trudgebury caught the most attention. Local lodge members were divided. Did the symbols of the craft go back to the Middle Dynasty, or did a bunch of bored Scotsmen make it all up on the dark eve of the Enlightenment only a few hundred years before? It was with 8-sided predictability that this very quickly gelled into schism, for there was nothing that lodgemen loved more than splitting into rival lodges and denouncing each other as pretenders. Thus did Omega Lodge split from the Solomon Lodge, and the ironically named United Lodge refused to have anything to do with either of them. Meanwhile, the Luxor Lodge claimed a monopoly on all things Egyptian and denounced the warrants of the Lux et Lux Lodge as spurious and creepy. The worshipful master of the regular lodge of free and accepted masons of Elegant Ridge and environs was voted down in an administrative ambush by a dozen disillusioned brothers. The Knights of the Bronze Rod denounced it as a Jewish conspiracy, and at the height of tension someone ate a ham sandwich on the steps of the synagogue. It was a colourful phase. Lodges proliferated like dynastic assertion. Soon there were no less than 14 accredited temples serving the pious riverlands, and they all claimed to have the authoritative stamp of ancient Egyptian ways. This is where Ken's forebears came in. Mabel and Frosty Sawleythorpe were avid readers of Revelation and came from a long line of wide-eyed masons. Frosty had at first been regular, free and accepted, but after the fuss he joined the Grand Luxor and denounced Omega Lodge as stooges of the Pope. Only the Grand Luxor was a lodge with a genuine and tested Egyptian appellation as far as he could tell. He looked it up in an atlas. Luxor was a city on the Nile, sure enough. Accordingly, he embraced the 11th degree of the York Rite, which enabled him to wear a fez and learn the mysteries of the pyramids off by heart. At this stage, though, Ken swerved to overcome a dangling log and reported on the Sawleythorpe arrangements in their domestic abode. They owned a little weatherboard on Jennings Street, he said. I remember playing on the front lawn when I was a kid. The Toyota bashed through another obstacle of scratchy scrub, and Buster paid attention. They were travelling northwards by then, towards the blaring sunshine, and the bush was getting thicker and more inhospitable. Over in the far distance somewhere must have been the river itself, but it flooded into dense, dark ponds that made the land into a stringy meander. For all useful purposes, Buster was completely lost, but he still had confidence that Ken knew where he was heading. "What did your father do?" asked Buster, although it might drive them on off the track. "He worked in the wharves as well," said Ken, "after he came out of the army." "And how did your grandparents get involved with the Tates?" That was getting to the point. The conversation had begun as an account of how Ken's grandparents had joined the likes of Russell Tate and his good wife Sheila, unorthodox masons certainly, and who were said to have made their own tomb of gold. Buster cast his eyes along the long drifts of scrubland, knowing how replete it was with feral cats. Somewhere out there, somewhere along the winding river, might yet be the treasury of ages. Ken, refusing to slow down, said he was getting to that. "You see, the Tates lived in Jennings Street too, just down the road, and my grandmother and Sheila would meet sometimes at the bus stop." Well, that explained it, or so it seemed. And yet there was also a Masonic connection from the outset. The Luxor Lodge, so it was believed, concealed a further secret lodge of advanced Luxor brothers, and indeed some sisters too. In conventional masonry, Ken was at pains to explain, the women just make the sandwiches. But in secret and advanced masonry, they may be illustrious, although to ever talk of this was strictly forbidden. There were great and wealthy men, he explained, who had been brought undone by loose tongues. Don't believe all that stuff about worshipping goats, though, he added. At least, not in the Luxor Lodge. Instead, behind the scenes, the inner sentinel protected the covert mysteries of woman. It was an arcane adjustment. Buster didn't know this. His understanding of the common Blue Lodge was somewhat retarded, but now it all made sense. Mabel and Sheila would meet on the bus, Frosty and Russell would meet at the temple, while beneath the blank curtain was a whole grand orient of deeply irregular lodges lurking, gathering at the lodge rooms, the so-called Memphis building, near the public library. This was in 1922, Buster asked, just checking. Yep, said Ken, 1922. There were about 3 squillion squares of desolate riverband, and no one kept a sturdy compass on it all. On the departmental maps it was just labelled swampy. Buster realised that it might take them some time. But how did it lead them to the secret tomb, he wanted to know. Ken swerved again. As I say, he said, it's a long story. So he began by reiteration. In the shimmering glare of King Tut's golden preserves, the repressed wonders of the ancient craft did emerge. The Tates had sailed the mighty river. They had stayed in Cairo on their honeymoon. Russell had pretensions that he had dreams in ancient Coptic. In these dreams, a venerable Grand Master, clad in his apron, would come in clouds of glory to sign the number 8 upon the dreamer's forehead, and then refrain in Coptic squiggle how the Pharaoh needs his rustic queen. As it happened, Sheila was expert at dream interpretation, and so the whole puzzle coagulated into a bold vision, the divine craftsman determining to rebuild his sanctuary through his humble workers in the new world of the South. That's how it happened, Buster marvelled. It was all because of dreams. Or visions, really, Ken corrected. It was a pearly juncture in history after all. That's what he was trying to say. When Howard Cartwise opened Tutankhamun's tomb, it wasn't just a job. Vortices of great incarnations worked across the power grids of the geometric planet. They basked in wonder. The Masonic lines hummed with nascent grandeur. The temple was wide open once more. Visions and premonitions poured out upon the culminating humanity. This, at least, was what people, certainly the Tates and Surlythorpes, believed. Ken believed it too, it seemed. He regretted having never lived back in the days of great discovery. Since then, he said, the cosmos had grown boring, all the secrets have been buried again, and the allure of Thebes has been cursed with modern indifference. He was resigned to living in times of leaden shadow. He killed wallabies for a living. This is why he had begun by telling Buster that it couldn't be done. He felt that the times were not ripe for new golden disclosures. He would drive Buster out to where it was, but he was sure they wouldn't find it. The cultists, back in the days, grew under the Tate's guiding hand. They reported a certain astral formation set into the unfamiliar landscape, and reminded members of the lodge that once, beyond the passing eons, the worn frame of Australian bedrock had once been the foundation of a continent now lost in the misty links of time. Yet the seers and the towering priests of yore had all spoken of it plainly. My grandparents lapped it all up, said Ken, still driving, which is why they gave their life savings to hasten the dawning day. In all, Ken went on, dozens of earnest souls donated a blazing optimism to the temple, and Russell and Sheila invested it in the golden thread, just then getting lucky. It all went pop in the crash of 1928, of course, but prior to that came a massive bout of inflation. Vast were the sums. This lent the episode its royal delusions. Ken turned left, never slowing down, as he related how Russell came to understand that he was a reincarnated Pharaoh, and how, therefore, his tidy little Sheila was his queen. Hail Queen Sheila, priestess of the star-sprung night. The magnitude of the river bend struck Buster again, and he could easily imagine how simple Cornish jollies, accustomed to grey England, might become entranced by the extraordinary sky. Ken explained that they had robes and crowns and gold insignia and silver starburst and sceptres inlaid with opals from dusty Coober Pedy. Their thrones were made of red gum, the toughest of native timbers. Pharaoh did prognosticate, and his queen, emblem of the cosmic order no less, sat in silence, unbidden. Then, all of a sudden, Ken came to a halt and the Toyota came to a stop in the mud. "We'll have to go on foot from here," said Ken. "It's just over the rise a little way." The rise? Buster could see no rise. The land about was as flat as roadkill. It had become decidedly swampy, and the smell of the white clay, fetid and unhealthy, swelled from the guts of the twisting riverbeds of a long-forgotten eventuality. All this talk about Egypt had made Buster anxious about crocodiles, sacred though they may be. There was a stuffed one in among King Tut's afterworld spree. He had seen it at the exhibition. It had probably gobbled up a slave or two. He felt like staying near to the car, but Ken strode off into the tortured thicket, still filling in bits of the long-winded prattle. There were no crocodiles to mention, but he did explain that the Pharaoh, Russell, had determined to construct the royal enclosure at the river bend because it was notoriously putrid with brown snakes and copperheads, royal creatures nonetheless. It was their venom made them holy. Pharaoh had a snake-entwined pillar as his emblem. They had consulted the oracles, and fate had determined the true location. The builders of the adytum were sworn to secrecy. They went out with picks and shovels every long weekend. In all, the members of the Luxor Lodge Irregular had invested a small fortune. Russell Tate took the role of Sun King, and his queen, an average-looking lady with blonde bobs and an English look on her face, was a lunar apparition bathed in royal stars. No one in the town knew all this. Everyone thought they were ordinary folk. It was a secret hidden from the common man who would be uncomprehending. The lodge, however, had grown prosperous from wise outlays and rode the gold boom into plans of ostentatious undertakings. There was the royal enclosure, far out in the wasted land. It made perfect sense in Russell's arcane geomancy, and the followers all followed. Ken pushed on. "It's around here somewhere," he was saying to himself. Amidst the evil-scented loam, he was searching for the landmark he had come to in his youth. He had explained it somewhat beforehand. When he was 8 or 9, his father, following a broad panel of handed-down instructions, had showed him to the entryway. It was all related then. Your grandmother, his father did entrust, knew an olden queen of Egypt who was buried in a wondrous crypt adorned with jewelly trinkets. As a boy, Ken was entranced and mopped it up forever. His father took him there, showed him the doorway, and taught him the trail of signs. It was a credible eventuality as far as Buster was concerned. For his part, he had read about it in a book, merely a footnote. But his investigations had arrived at length at Ken. He was hoping for a breakthrough. "What do you know about Sheila?" he called, also hoping that Ken wouldn't lose him in the snake-infested rummage. He was happy to be wearing solid boots. "Well, she died," called back Ken, "and therefore the royal tomb." Stricken, the Pharaoh and his followers, the whole order of Luxor, returned their enclosure to its celestial purpose after all. They finished it hurriedly and laid the great queen to rest within the depths of the grateful earth. It was said, Ken related, that they tried to have her mummified, but the local funeral home didn't have the equipment. Instead, they dug a deep tunnel, first to an entryway they called the Chamber of Horus, and then to the Chamber of the Queen itself, large and oblong, decked out in bold Masonic items and provisions for her journey into the rivers of beyond. Above all, they buried her with gold. Her sarcophagus was inlaid and oddments forged of the eternal metal, shone about her noble head. On the sealed doorway to the Queen's chamber was the gold inscription, Queen Sheila I, in Russell's mangled Coptic. There was no reliable estimation, but maybe a third of the golden thread had found its way into her mausoleum. By this time, Ken had explained, it was the late 1920s and the markets were looking lonesome. Russell decided to bury all his tithings. The wealthy socialites and well-connected financiers who had lately joined the lodge were soon investing too. The Rustic Queen went into the underworld, a very wealthy woman. The question, though, was where was the tomb? It was about an hour out of Bangham Bridges, deep in the scrubby Malays, but only little Ken knew the exact location. There's a big white tree, he said, not far from the big black rock. Buster was too busy watching out for snakes. He wondered what had become of Pharaoh and his minions. Had they not returned to raid the tomb after the markets had recovered? Ken explained that not long after that, Russell had been run out of town by a posse from Omega Lodge who said he was a Mormon. He headed off to Rockhampton, but was never seen again. As for Mabel and Frosty, they believed the curse implicitly, namely that intruders would be rendered into dust and blown away by a mystic wind. They were never prepared to risk it. "What about you?" Buster asked Ken, inquiring. "Do you believe in the mystic wind?" Before he could answer, Ken swung around, hopped up on his toe balls, and pointed with an excited fist. "Over there," he cried. "The big black rock." He pushed aside the coffee bush and beams of scrawny wattle and thumped through the mud to what was indeed a big black rock, just as he had foretold. Buster had never doubted his directions, although admittedly along the way he had wondered if they had found the right bend in the river, for there were many. "There should be a big white tree here somewhere then," Ken said, scouring about. Buster looked around. The dense and unattractive folly of stunted vegetation. In the far distance, the unremarkable horizon. Ken clambered up the rock for a better view. Over there, he shouted. Then he went thrashing, and Buster plodded along. Here it is, yelled the Ken man. And sure enough, a huge white tree, strangled like a limp grub, loomed up amongst the ugly overhang. Buster remembered the snakes, but he assumed that Ken's noisy feet would give them all fair warning. Right from the start, Ken had the goods. When Buster first approached him, he was able to relate both names and places. There were photographs of well-dressed lodgemen and their ladies, with Turkish gentlemen with walking canes, in colonial Art Deco surrounds. Ken kept a book of minutes passed down through his dad. "Can you take me out there?" asked Buster, and Ken had nodded to the grey Toyota with his approval and swore he would as soon as the roads were dry. When Buster caught up with him, though, Ken was standing quite dejected. "What's the matter?" he did ask. He looked at the tree. He looked at Ken. Then he saw the brown waters of the rolling Murrumbidgee down below. They had reached the curve in the river. The river, yes, the river. "The river," said Ken, stuck. "What?" Ken pointed as if to say, "Can't you see it? Are you blind?" "The river." Buster didn't get it, so Ken had to help him understand. "The river," he said again. "It's moved." "What do you mean?" "Well, it never used to come up this far." "No?" "No." "So where's the tomb?" asked Buster, sticking to the script. Ken shook his head and tried to re-agitate his bearings. "Well, if the big white tree is here, then it's under the river," he exclaimed. "What do you mean?" "Well, the river's moved. That's exactly where the tomb was, just over there." "Are you sure?" Ken was pointing to a little eddy in the froth 20 metres from the shoreline. Just to be certain, Ken stood back and cast his eye across the desiccated herbage. He looked back at the big black rock and then again to the tree, gnarly and pale, and then around at the clay formations, misshapen by the sun and years. He stepped back further and looked around again. The tree, gnarly and pale, was now clinging to the riverbank, whereas once it stood rooted in a field of dry mud. "Sure, I'm sure," he conceded. He paced it out. "There's the rock, there's the tree. So the entry to the tomb is," and he pointed out into the middle of the river once again. The floodplain would meander. The Murrumbidgee knows no permanent attachments. Ken checked once more, but could only conclude that the river's mighty weight had forsaken all their dreams. He sat down eventually and said, "Bloody hell. It must have been the big floods of '82. The sides of the twisted gorge must have given way. When the springtime resumed, the river had claimed a swath of clayey dredge and found another pathway to the sea. The flat lowlands of the river bend could offer no resistance. Was the edifice washed away?" "Oh no," said Ken. They sat down on the bankside and contemplated the passing waters. It was all they could do. "It'll still be down there," he said, "underneath the river. They built it with an eternal seal. Could it withstand the raging seepage then?" He believed it could. The Tates, as he had been relating, had honeymooned along the ancient valley, and Russell had studied the construction of the pyramids and knew the arcane laws of masonry which had even withstood the deluge of Atlantis in its day. Deep below the oceans, although this is a teaching of the 33rd degree and not for neophytes, were splendid temples, watertight, and waiting for the passage of the 4 ages. The Queen's chamber, at least, was made to last. This was not what Buster Craven had expected. His research had led him to a man who throttled wallabies, to an arid turn of ruined land, and to a river intent on concealing a lasting enigma. Cornish miners had toiled a mile below the surface down in Ivy's Rump, blasting their way into the quartz, and dug up gorgeous seams of the golden thread. Now the best of it, sculpted into hyenas' heads and the arching forms of Nuit, was submerged under megalitres of silty runoff, alive with carp and pink-bellied perch. Ken was adamant. There was nothing else around. Sheila Tate lay entombed below the season's waters. "Damn," said Buster. "Yep," said Ken. The trip home was just as abrupt. The grey Toyota crashed its way through the overgrown tracks and Buster's coccyx grew weary. The low-lying scrub seemed to stretch on forever until Buster was surprised when they finally re-emerged onto the bitumen road joining with the interstate, where it turned off towards Cooley's barn. Ken still had his mental folders open and was relating more of the Surlythorpe's saga. His father had lost his job when the wharves closed in 1949 and went into selling home and contents insurance. Ironically, the family abode in Jennings Street succumbed to white ants and wasn't covered by a policy. The era of the warring lodges had subsided long ago, and the old temple building had been converted into a roller rink most recently. The magic of Tutankhamun's unexpected arrival had seeded the 20th century with primitive influences, some benign and some stalking like a re-established mummy in search of its long-lost soul. "I never got into it," said Ken, referring to the craft. "All those silly handshakes and what?" "No," said Buster, agreeing. Was it true there were stolen miracles among the treasures of Luxor Murrumbidgee? Ken related that the Tates had been implicated in removing sacred objects from Egypt's sandy bosom, although no one ever proved it either way. It was rumoured the lodge building featured idols from the 18th dynasty at least. He then surmised that these and their power rays, as he put it, had been successfully interred, and like his ancestors before him, he believed that this was probably a good thing. "You know," he said, as they made it back into Bangham Bridges, "you should count yourself lucky that it's underneath the river. You don't want to upset ancient curses." He was a surprisingly spiritual man. Buster, in fact, was more interested in the gold. If you follow the golden thread, it leads you to obsessions of antiquity and a determination to uncover the vain treasuries of man. "Did she wear a death mask?" he asked, meaning the belated Queen. "A stunning likeness," Ken assured him, or so his father had said. Buster considered the logistics of geographical hydraulics. He considered the mystic wind. He wondered if he was the man to move a stubborn river.